There are moments in a man's life when he stands at the edge of everything he's built and realizes it was never truly his to build it all. Cheek stood on that land in the dying light of evening, his shoes caked in red earth, his eyes scanning the foundation of a house that refused to rise. The wind carried something that night, not quite a voice, not quite a memory, but something that made his skin crawl and his breath catch. He had paid good money for this land. He had signed papers, shaken hands, told himself he was finally home. But as the sun dropped below the tree line and the shadows grew long across the cracked well where his father used to draw water, Cheeky felt what every man fears most, that some debts are paid not in currency, but in blood, and some purchases come with a price that no amount of money can ever settle. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is a story about inheritance, but not the kind that brings families together. It's about the invisible weight of land, the kind that holds memories in its soil and secrets in its roots. In Umuagu village, where the old people still pour libation before planting season, and where every family can trace their lineage back 7 generations, there was a piece of land that everyone knew, but no one wanted. It sat at the edge of the main farmlands, a stretch of red earth bordered by an ancient mango tree and a well that had run dry years before Papa Okonkwo died. The villagers would walk past it quickly, their eyes averted, their conversations falling silent until they were safely beyond its boundaries. When Chike returned from the city with money in his pocket and ambition in his heart, his brothers saw an opportunity. They needed cash. He needed land. It seemed like a simple transaction, but in Umuagu, nothing involving that particular plot of earth was ever simple. Papa Okonkwo had been a man of few words and many secrets. He was the kind of father who worked from dawn until his shadow disappeared into the evening, whose hands were permanently stained with soil, whose back was bent from decades of wrestling sustenance from stubborn ground. He had 3 sons, and he loved them all in the way that strong, silent men love, through provision, through example, through the slow accumulation of property and reputation that he hoped would outlast him. Obinna, the eldest, had inherited his father's temperament, steady, traditional, suspicious of change. Ikenna, the middle son, had inherited his restlessness, always looking beyond the village, always imagining a life where success was measured in something other than yam harvests. And then there was Chike, the youngest, who had inherited perhaps the most dangerous trait of all, his father's stubbornness, but without the wisdom of years to temper it. When Papa Okonkwo died suddenly one rainy season, collapsing in the very field he had tended for 40 years, he left behind land, livestock, and a warning that only the oldest villagers remembered he had once spoken. The division of the inheritance was not peaceful. For 3 months the brothers argued while their father's compound slowly fell into disrepair. Obinna wanted to keep everything together, to maintain the family holdings as their father had done, to honor the old ways. Ikenna wanted to sell it all, split the money, and finally leave the village that had never felt like enough for him. Chika, fresh from 5 years working in Lagos, said little during these arguments. He sat under that same mango tree where his father used to rest between planting seasons, and he drew plans in a notebook, plans for a modern house with painted walls and a generator, plans for a life that proved he had made something of himself, plans that required land. When the arguments reached their breaking point, the brothers agreed to divide the property. Obinna took the portion nearest the main road. Ikenna took the section that bordered the new development, knowing it would fetch the highest price when he eventually sold. And Chike? Cheek said he would wait. He didn't need land yet, he told them. But what he was really doing was watching, calculating, planning for the piece they had all avoided discussing. The heart of their father's original farm, the section where Papa Okonkwo's first hut had stood, where the old well marked the center of everything their family had built. 2 years passed. Obinna farmed his portion diligently, though the yields were never quite what his father had managed to produce. Ikenna sold his section to a businessman from the city and moved to Abuja, sending money home occasionally, but never visiting. And Cheek worked and saved, his eyes always on that central plot that nobody wanted. The land sat empty, growing wild, the mango tree dropping fruit that rotted where it fell because even the children wouldn't venture close enough to harvest it. The old people in the village would sometimes gather in the evening under the ukwa tree in the village square, and when the conversation turned to land and legacy, someone would always mention Papa Okonkwo's plot. They would shake their heads slowly, the way old people do when they've seen patterns repeat across generations. They would remember how Papa Okonkwo himself had been warned when he first cleared that section, how he had dismissed the warnings the same way young men always do, how he had prospered for years before the land began to exact its own kind of payment. But memories fade, stories become exaggerated, and by the time Cheeky made his move, the warnings had been reduced to village superstition, the kind of old-fashioned thinking that modern educated men could safely ignore. When Ikenna called Cheeky with an offer to sell his inherited portion for a fraction of its value, Cheeky saw his chance. He bought it immediately, sight unseen, money transferred within days. 6 months later, when Obinna's farm failed for the third consecutive season, and desperation made him willing to sell what he had once wanted to keep, Cheek bought that portion too. And then came the central plot, the piece that had belonged to their father's father, the section that none of them had inherited individually, because Papa Okonkwo had made it clear in his final days, though never in writing, that it should remain untouched. But death has a way of making verbal agreements disappear. Legal documents, however, are permanent. Through a combination of legal maneuvering and family pressure, Cheeky acquired the rights to the entire original family holding. He now owned, for the price of what a modest car would cost in Lagos, every inch of land his father had worked. He told his wife, Kioma, that they were going home to build their future. He told his friends in the city that he was investing wisely, buying property while it was cheap. He told himself that he was honoring his father's memory by reclaiming the family land. But he never told anyone about the dreams that had started the night he signed the final papers, dreams where his father stood by the dry well, not speaking, just watching with eyes that held something between sorrow and warning. The construction began in the dry season, when the ground was hard and the sun was merciless. Cheek hired a crew of workers from a neighboring village, men who didn't know the stories, who saw only a job and steady pay. The first week went well. They cleared the overgrowth, cut down the smaller trees, marked out the foundation with string and wooden stakes. But in the second week, something shifted. The workers found bones while digging the foundation. Not unusual in land that had been farmed for generations, they reasoned. Animals died. Things got buried. The earth held its dead close. But these bones were wrapped in cloth, arranged in a pattern that suggested intention rather than accident. The oldest worker, a man named Obi who had worked construction across 3 states, stood looking at the arrangement for a long time before quietly suggesting they stop digging in that particular spot. Cheeky, who had driven down from Lagos for the weekend to check on progress, laughed off the concern. He instructed them to carefully rebury the bones in a different location and continue with the foundation. The workers complied, but 3 of them never returned after that weekend. They sent word that they had found other jobs, better-paying jobs, jobs that didn't make their skin prickle and their sleep restless. What would you have done if this happened to you? Would you have seen it as a sign or dismissed it as coincidence the way Cheeky did? The new workers Cheeky hired didn't last much longer. Tools went missing overnight, only to reappear in strange places, hammers in the dry well, bags of cement torn open and scattered, marking strings cut or moved so that measurements no longer matched. Every morning brought some new small disaster that delayed progress by hours or days. The workers began to complain about the atmosphere on the site, how the air felt heavy even when the day was clear, how sound seemed muffled as if something was absorbing the noise, how they all felt watched even when Cheeky wasn't there supervising. Animals avoided the construction site entirely. The goats that normally wandered freely through the village, scavenging whatever they could find, would approach the edge of the property and stop abruptly, bleating in distress before turning back. Dogs refused to cross onto the land, even when called by their owners. Birds would fly overhead but never land in that remaining mango tree, which stood at the center of where the house was being built, a living marker of the land's history. Cheek dismissed all of it. He was an educated man, he told his wife during their nightly phone calls, while he stayed in the small lodge in the nearest town. He had studied business administration. He understood construction, logistics, labor management. What he didn't understand, what he refused to understand, was what the villagers tried to tell him in their careful, respectful way when he came to the market to buy supplies. They would sell him what he needed, but they would avoid his eyes. They would ask about his family, about his work in Lagos, about everything except the one thing that mattered: why he was building where no one should build. The village head, Mazi Ezenwa, finally approached him one evening as Chiki was preparing to return to Lagos for the week. The old man spoke softly, choosing his words with the care of someone who has seen pride destroy better men than this one. He reminded Cheek that Papa Okonkwo himself had once said that after his death, that central portion of land should rest. He mentioned, delicately, never accusing, that some places hold more than soil and stones, that some ground has memory, that wisdom sometimes sounds like superstition until it's too late to remember the difference. Chike thanked Mazi Ezenwa for his concern and continued building, but that night, alone in his lodge room, he couldn't shake the old man's words. For the first time since beginning the project, doubt crept in, not belief in spirits or curses, but a quieter question. What if his father had known something he didn't? What if that land was cheap, not because his brothers were desperate, but because it was worth exactly what he had paid? The thought lasted only until morning, when pride and sunlight drove away the shadows of uncertainty. He had invested too much to stop now. He had promised Kioma a house. He had told everyone in Lagos about his plans. Stopping would mean admitting he had made a mistake, and Cheek had spent his entire adult life proving that he didn't make mistakes. So he pushed forward, hiring yet another crew, offering higher wages, promising bonuses for quick completion. The foundation was finally poured. The walls began to rise. And then came the morning when Chike arrived at the site to find his name carved into the bark of the old mango tree. Carved deep, carved recently, carved in letters that matched his father's handwriting exactly as Chike remembered it from old letters and documents. Nobody admitted to carving it. The workers, now drawn from 3 different villages and speaking different dialects, all denied any knowledge of it. Cheek examined the carving in the harsh morning light, his fingers tracing the letters that spelled out his full name. Chike Okonkwo. Not a threat, not a message, just his name, as if the tree itself was claiming to know him, acknowledging his presence in a way that felt more like recognition than greeting. That night, he decided to sleep on the site in his car, determined to catch whoever was sabotaging his work. He parked where he could see the entire construction area, locked the doors, and settled in to wait. The evening was still, the kind of tropical stillness that feels like the world is holding its breath. As darkness fell completely, Chiki noticed how absolute the quiet became. No crickets, no night birds, no distant dogs barking, just silence so complete it seemed to have weight. He fought sleep for hours, his eyes burning, his body tense, until finally, sometime after midnight, he heard it. A sound like breathing, slow and steady, coming from the direction of the well. He turned on his car's headlights, flooding the construction site with harsh white light. There was nothing there, no one, just the half-built walls of his house, the mango tree, and the old well where his father used to draw water 3 times a day. But when Chiki stepped out of the car, compelled by something he couldn't name, and walked to the well's edge, he heard it again, not breathing now, but a voice, faint as if coming from a great distance or depth, speaking words he almost recognized in a dialect he almost understood. The voice said something that sounded like, "Go back." It said something that sounded like, "My son." It said something that sounded like his father's voice on the last day Cheek had seen him alive, weak but determined, trying to tell him something important, while Cheek, impatient and late for his bus back to Lagos, had only half listened. Cheek backed away from the well, returned to his car, and sat there trembling until dawn. He told himself it was wind. He told himself it was imagination, amplified by exhaustion. He told himself everything except what he knew in the oldest part of himself, that something on this land wanted him gone, and that something might have every right to want exactly that. Do you think he should have left then? Or was it already too late? When Kioma came to visit with their young daughter, she felt it immediately, the wrongness that Chiki had been trying to ignore. She was a practical woman, a nurse who dealt in observable symptoms and treatable conditions, not prone to fears or fantasies. But within an hour of arriving at the construction site, she was ready to leave. The heaviness in the air, the way their daughter wouldn't stop crying whenever they got within sight of the foundation, the feeling that they were unwelcome not in a hostile way, but in the way you might unwelcome someone who has innocently walked into a private family gathering uninvited. She asked Chika, in the careful way a wife asks when she knows the answer might cause a fight, if he had really thought this through. She reminded him that they had a good life in Lagos, that they didn't need this house, that some dreams cost more than their worth. He heard the fear in her voice, saw it in the way she held their daughter close, and it made him angry. Not at her, but at himself for feeling the same fear and being unable to admit it. He told her the house would be finished in 3 months. He told her everything would be fine once they moved in. He told her all the things we tell ourselves when we're trapped between pride and wisdom and can't find a way back. The pastor came on a Wednesday, brought at Kioma's insistence and Cheek's reluctant agreement. He was a young man from one of the new Pentecostal churches, full of faith and certainty, carrying holy water in plastic bottles and a Bible with worn edges. He walked the perimeter of the construction site, praying loudly, commanding whatever spirits might be present to leave in Jesus' name, sprinkling water on the foundation and the walls and the old mango tree. Everything seemed fine until he approached the well. As he raised the bottle to pour water into its depths, the plastic cracked in his hand, not broke, but cracked in multiple places simultaneously, water leaking through his fingers. He stood there confused, examining the bottle, trying to understand how intact plastic could suddenly fail. He took out a second bottle, attempted the same blessing, and watched as this one too developed cracks before the water could be poured. The pastor, to his credit, remained calm. He suggested that perhaps a more powerful deliverance was needed, that this was clearly a stronghold of darkness requiring fasting and extended prayer. But as he spoke, a wind rose from nowhere, strong enough to scatter his papers and send dust swirling around the construction site, and in that wind, Chike heard something that made his blood freeze. Laughter, faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the well. The pastor left shortly after, promising to pray from the safety of his church, but declining to return to the site. Word spread quickly through the village, as word always does in places where everyone knows everyone, and secrets are valuable currency. The workers quit in a group, refusing even the wages owed them, just wanting distance from that place. Cheek found himself alone on the property, standing among half-built walls and abandoned tools, the silence broken only by the wind through the mango tree's leaves. He thought about his father, really thought about him for the first time since this whole project began. Papa Okonkwo had been a private man, but there had been times, rare, late at night, when the kerosene lamp burned low, when he had spoken to his sons about respect. Not respect for people, but respect for land, for history, for the things that came before and would remain after. Chiki had listened with the impatience of youth, certain that the future mattered more than the past, that progress meant leaving old ideas behind. Standing there in the fading light, He wondered if his father had been trying to teach him something he was only now old enough to understand. That night, the rain came. Not the gentle evening rain that the farmers prayed for, but a torrential downpour that seemed to target that one plot of land with specific fury. Lightning struck so close that Cheeky, watching from the lodge in town, could see each flash illuminate his construction site through the sheets of water. Thunder shook the building. By morning, when he drove out to survey the damage, he found that half of what he had built was simply gone. Not knocked down by wind or washed away by water, gone as if it had never been there. The foundation scraped clean, stones scattered, cement dissolved. The mango tree still stood, untouched. The well still gaped open, its depths darker than before. And carved into the freshest section of remaining wall, in those same letters that matched his father's handwriting, were 3 words: "Not for you." Chike knelt in the mud, surrounded by the ruins of his ambition, and for the first time since he was a child he wept. Not tears of sadness, but tears of helplessness, the kind that come when you finally understand that there are forces in the world that don't care about your plans or your pride. The village seer lived 3 hours away in a compound that smelled of smoke and herbs. Cheek found her through whispered references and reluctant directions, the kind of guidance people give when they know you're headed toward a truth you're not ready to hear. She was older than the oldest person he had ever met, her eyes clouded with age, but somehow still seeing more than younger, clearer eyes could perceive. She listened to his story without interrupting, occasionally nodding, sometimes sighing in a way that suggested she had heard variations of this tale many times before. When he finished, she was quiet for so long that he thought she might have fallen asleep. Then she spoke, and her voice had the quality of someone reading from a book only she could see. She told him about sacred ground, about the original settlers of Umuagu, about a burial place that predated every family's memory, about his father discovering this while clearing the land as a young man. Papa Okonkwo had been warned then, she said. He had been told to choose a different section. But he had been ambitious, and that particular section was the most fertile, and ambition makes young men deaf to warnings. So he had made a bargain, the way desperate people do. He would use the land, but he would never own it in his heart. He would prosper from it, but his children would never be allowed to claim it, and most importantly, after his death, it must rest. No building, no permanent structures, no attempts to make it something other than what it was. Do you think a man can bind his children with promises they never made? Can the sins of fathers truly be inherited by sons? Cheek felt something break inside him as he listened. Not his spirit, but his certainty, that fundamental belief that we control our own destinies. He asked the seer what he could do, how he could fix this, how much it would cost to make the land accept him. She looked at him with something like pity, the way you might look at a child who has just understood that actions have consequences that persist beyond apology. She told him that some debts cannot be paid with money, that some mistakes are fixed not by trying harder but by letting go, that the land didn't reject him out of cruelty but out of memory, the way a body rejects an organ that doesn't belong. The spirits his father had offended through years of hidden guilt and deferred responsibility had waited patiently through Papa Okonkwo's lifetime and beyond, content to remain quiet until someone tried to claim permanent ownership of what could only ever be temporarily borrowed. By buying the land from his brothers, by attempting to build his legacy on his father's compromise, Chike had awakened something that would not sleep again until the balance was restored. The seer gave him instructions: palm oil, white cloth, words of release spoken at dawn. And then, she told him firmly, he had to let it go. Not just stop building, let it go completely, give up the claim, allow the land to return to what it had always been meant to be. The ritual felt foolish at first, walking barefoot across the land he had paid for, carrying offerings to earth that he had thought of as commodity. But as he poured the palm oil at the base of the mango tree, as he spread the white cloth over the edge of the well, As he spoke the words the seer had taught him in a language he barely understood, something shifted. The heaviness that had pressed down on that place for months seemed to lift slightly, not disappearing entirely, but becoming less oppressive, less hostile. The wind through the mango tree sounded different, still not welcoming, but no longer warning. Cheek knelt on the ground where his foundation had been, his hands flat against the red earth, and he spoke to his father the way he should have spoken to him years ago, not demanding, not explaining, just listening finally to what the land had been trying to tell him all along. He apologized not for buying the land. Money was money, transactions were transactions, but for not understanding what his father had tried to leave him that was more valuable than property. A lesson about knowing when to walk away, about understanding that some victories are actually defeats disguised by our pride. Selling the land was harder than buying it had been. Who wants to purchase property that comes with stories of failed construction and midnight voices? But eventually, Cheeky found a buyer, a farming cooperative that intended to use it for communal crops, rotating plantings, no permanent structures. They paid less than what he had invested, but that was appropriate somehow, an economic lesson to match the spiritual one. With that money, he commissioned a simple shrine on the corner of the property, nothing elaborate, just a marker to acknowledge what lay beneath, to maintain the memory that his father had tried to keep. He arranged for an elder in Umwagu to tend it, sent money annually for offerings, never missed a payment. He returned to Lagos with Kioma and their daughter, moved into a rental apartment that cost more per month than the entire land purchase had cost, and slowly rebuilt his life in a space that welcomed him rather than warned him away. Years later, when his daughter was old enough to ask questions about the village where her grandfather had lived, Chike took her back to Umwagu. They walked past the old family land, now lush with cassava and vegetables, the mango tree still standing, but somehow looking less ominous, more like what it was, an old tree on old land. His daughter asked why they didn't own any land there, why they lived in the city when they had family roots in this place. Chike thought about how to explain it, how to pass on the lesson he had learned without sounding like the superstitious old people he had once dismissed. He settled on the truth, or at least a version of it that a child could understand. Some things are not for owning. Some places are not for claiming. The land takes care of those who respect it, but it will never belong to anyone who thinks respect means simply paying money. His daughter nodded, not really understanding but sensing the weight behind his words, the way children do when adults are speaking from scars rather than theories. The moral of Cheek's story is not about spirits or curses or supernatural vengeance. It's about something more subtle and more universal. The weight of inheritance, the cost of pride, the difference between owning and belonging. His father had carried a secret burden for decades, a compromise that had allowed him to prosper while knowing he was borrowing something that could never truly be his. Rather than share that burden and that knowledge with his sons, he had tried to take it to the grave, hoping perhaps that silence would end the debt. But in a world where land has memory and communities preserve knowledge across generations, some secrets refuse to stay buried. Chike had thought himself modern, educated, beyond the reach of village superstitions. What he learned was that wisdom is not the same as progress, that respecting the past is not the same as being trapped by it, and that sometimes the most important transactions are the ones where you understand what you're really buying before you sign your name. If you were in Cheek's position, would you have sold the land when the problem started, or would you have fought to keep what you had paid for? Do you believe that places can carry the weight of history in ways that resist our attempts to rewrite them? These are not questions about ghosts or spirits, but about memory, about respect, about understanding that we are not as separate from our past as we sometimes like to believe. Cheek learned these lessons the hard way, through financial loss and spiritual confrontation, through the destruction of his plans and the humbling of his pride. But he learned them, which is more than many of us do. He learned that some roots go deeper than money can reach, that some prices are paid not once but across generations, and that the land, patient, ancient, remembering, will always have the final word about who belongs and who is merely passing through. If this story has made you think about your own relationship with inheritance, with land, with the debts and gifts passed down through generations, let us know in the comments. And if you believe, as the people of Umuagu do, that the earth beneath our feet holds more than soil and stones, subscribe to hear more stories where every ending carries a lesson and every lesson comes with a price. Because in the end, we are all cheeky in one way or another, standing on ground we think we own, learning slowly that ownership and belonging are not the same thing, discovering that respect is not something you pay for once, but something you practice every day, and understanding finally that the land remembers everything, forgets nothing, and waits patiently for us to learn what it has been trying to teach us all along.